Good afternoon, BookTube. It's Tony here from Locks to Reads. Today I'm going to do my video on memoir and fiction recommendations from World War One. Now, a couple of caveats. First of all, these are books published between 1916 and 1936. I haven't read a great deal of contemporary fiction about World War One, which is something I intend to rectify. The one that springs to mind that I've definitely read is Pat Barker's Regeneration. There are probably a couple of others, but off the top of my head I couldn't think of them. So these are books that were published by people that actually were involved in World War One to some level or another. And the second caveat is that I have put memoirs and fiction together on this list because a lot of the fiction books are basically thinly disguised non-fiction. They're thinly disguised memoirs. They were written by people who, for various reasons, chose not to just write a memoir. A couple of them cover more than the war itself, but mostly they focus on the war. And I'm gonna do them in a kind of publication order, but there'll be a couple of points where I link two books together. So the first book to mention, published in 1916, is can I get my finger out of the way? Is Under Fire by Henri Barbusse. It was published in 1916. It's fiction, but it's based on Barbusse's own experiences on the front. It's French, and it's actually a very interesting read. It's interesting to read books by non-British writers about World War One because you get a perspective that you don't get elsewhere, and it helps you understand the whole conflict. It was a phenomenal success when it came out. It's the first, obviously, of these kind of books published. And it's more journalistic stroke, as in not journalistic, as in journal, as in diaryistic, and episodic than a sort of straightforward novel. But it's very realistically written. There's no sort of artsy-fartsy hangovers from the late 19th century. It's a fair, straight down the line book. In fact, I believe it was something of an influence on Ernest Hemingway's writing style. So first off, Henri Barbusse, Under Fire. Next up, Nothing of Importance by Bernard Adams, which was published, I think, in 1917, posthumously. He was at the front with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. By the way, a little step here. The Royal Welsh Fusiliers come up a lot in this list. I think 5 of the books were written by men or officers of the Royal Welsh Fusiliers. I'm not sure what it is about the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, but they contribute a lot of World War One literature. And 2 people who aren't on this list, David Jones of in parenthesis fame, and Llewellyn, who was a Welsh language poet. He was killed in World War One. They were both in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, although they were in the territorial bits. The other guys were in the non-territorial bits. Military historians will know what I'm talking about. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, just a brief Royal Welsh Fusiliers moment there. Now, Bernard Adams was he wrote his book. It's basically, the full title is A Record of Importance, A Record of Importance, Nothing of Importance, a record of 8 months on the front line with a Welsh battalion, October 1915 to June 1916. It's reproduced from letters and diaries, and it was sort of pushed through by his sister after he died. It was written during he was wounded in 1916, and it was written during his recovery from that. He was shot in the badly wounded in the forearm, so he had to spend some time recovering, and then he went back to the front in 1917 and died February 1917 on the Somme. Siegfried Sassoon had a copy of this book, which he read and annotated, and then gave to Wilfred Owen before Wilfred Owen returned to the front in 1918. It's now in the Wilfred Owen collection in the Bodleian Library. It's This is a really interesting one because I'd never heard this book, and when I read it, it reads, the first chunk of it reads almost like it was written by Hugh Laurie's character from Blackadder Goes Forth, and then there's a turn towards the end, which is absolutely heartbreaking, and it involves seeing, and it's quite a hard section to read because it's about seeing a dead soldier that he feels very strongly about, and the wound is horrific, and then there's a bit at the end where he talks about his hopes for the future, and it's even more heartbreaking because you know there is no future, that he's going away to die. I actually found it really moving to read at the end, and I admit I cried. It's one of those books that you think, oh, this is interesting, fine, it's good fun, and then it suddenly just takes this terrible turn. So that's Nothing of Importance by Bernard Adams. Next up is Diary of a Dead Officer by Arthur Graham West. That came out in 1919. It's been recently republished, I think in May of this year, by Pen and Sword Books. It's made up of diaries, letters, poems, and it was released in 1919, edited by a historian that was probably forgotten now, Cyril Joad. Now, Cyril Joad was a pacifist, and the way he wrote the introduction to the book, he sort of portrayed Arthur Graham West as something of a pacifist, and actually him and Siegfried Sassoon were both heavily influenced by Bertrand Russell, but Arthur Graham West chose to go back to the front, and so when it was republished in 2007 with an introduction by Nigel Jones, which kind of puts things into a different perspective, and it is it's a really interesting book because it's direct. It talks about how he's sort of ordinary does, it contemplates death, and then it has some of his poetry at the end. One of his poems, God, how I hate you, you young cheerful men, is probably one of the angriest poems written in World War One. It's worth reading, but he wasn't happy. But yeah, Diary of a Dead Officer by Arthur Graham West. Then the next one is Storm of Steel by Ernst Junger. Now, this is the first German book on the list. This is fictional, but again, it's thinly based. No, it's a memoir. What am I talking about? This is actually a memoir by Ernst Junger. Now, Ernst Junger, I'm going to pair this one with All Quiet on the Western Front, also a German book, obviously. That wasn't published until 1928. Now, All Quiet on the Western Front is fictional. Storm of Steel is not. Remarque's book is seen as quite pacifistic, anti-war. Ernst Junger's book is definitely not that, and their reception by people let's call them Nazis because that's what they were, is completely different. Now, Junger was a nationalist, a militaristic nationalist, although he never supported the Nazis directly. He was in the Wehrmacht and served as an officer, a captain in the Wehrmacht in Paris in 1940s, in 1941, I think. But he was kicked out of the army in 1944 because he was tendentially attached to the plot to kill Hitler, and he and both Goebbels and Hitler liked the Storm of Steel. Don't let that put you off. It seems like a big thing to put you off because it is a very well written book, and it does give a different picture of World War One because it's very neutral is not the right word, but it talks about war in a very different way to most other books on this list, and it also gives you an idea of the difficulties that were to come from a generation of young German men after the war was over. there's a quote from the introduction that says basically, it celebrates the front experience as a welcome and long overdue release from the stifling security of pre-war Wilhelmian middle classes. Yeah, it's not a sad war book. It's a book about war that's told by somebody that actually didn't exactly hate war, which makes it, as I said, very unusual for this list. All Quiet on the Western Front, obviously fictional. People know about that book. It's probably the most famous book from World War One. It's again based on Remarque's own experiences. People didn't. Certain people didn't like it. The Nazis. It was burned. It's one of the first books to be burned by the Nazis in the 1930s, and it was seen as an anti-war, anti-German book. It's brilliantly written. It's one of the best books from World War One. It's the one that's been filmed. There's 3 film version, a great silent version, a color version, and the most recent version, which I think is a very good World War One film, but a terrible version of this book. But yeah, so that's All Quiet on the Western Front and Storm of Steel. Next up is I'll be very brief about this one, but Seven Pillars of Wisdom by T.E. Lawrence. That was published in 1926. That's a bigger, chunkier book about, obviously, Lawrence of Arabia's, in inverted commas, experiences of his time in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a mixture of a book about war and a philosophical text, and contemplative text. I enjoyed reading it. It's quite inconsistently paced, is what I would say. But it is. I think it's an absolute book worth reading. I'd like to reread it because I read it a lot of these books I read a long time ago. When I first started getting back into, I think it was around 2014 when I started getting interested in, because of the 100th anniversary, getting interested in war again, and a lot of them I read around that time. So I'd like to reread it again, but I do recommend it because it's well worth reading, and also Lawrence of Arabia is one of the great films of all time, but it's nice to read his account. There are biographies of T.E. Lawrence that you can read to sort of put against his own words. But yeah, so Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Next, Undertones of War by Edmund Blunden. That was published in 1928. Actually, 1928 is the first year when these things start coming out in numbers. So there's Undertones of War in 1928. The Forbidden Zone by Mary Borden, which I've mentioned in a previous video, 1928. And Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man by Siegfried Sassoon. Now, Undertones of War is a memoir. Forbidden Zone is a memoir. Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man is a fictional book about a character called George Sherston, but it's clearly about Siegfried Sassoon. That now it's a trilogy of books. There's a memoir of a fox hunting man, memoirs of an infantry officer, and Sherston's progress. So that they are 1928 for memoirs of a fox hunting man, 1930 for memoirs of an infantry officer, and 1936 for Sherston's progress. I recommend them as a trilogy. They are so well written, and they are partly an elegy to a forgotten lost Britain of a certain privileged class. I mean, you don't get more privileged a title than Memoirs of a Fox Hunting Man, but they're really well written and really, and the way they build up to the war and then into the war and then after the war is so well done. I think Siegfried Sassoon might be one of my favourite writers from the war, as an all-around package. I wish I knew more about him. That's something I do need to fix, because he lived quite long after the war. Again, there's a film, Benediction, that came out fairly recently with Peter Capaldi as the older Sassoon that I quite enjoyed. I don't think it's the perfect film, but it's worth watching. This has become slightly oddly a film recommendations video as well. I should also recommend there is a 1990s Welsh language film called Heddwyn, which is about Heddwyn, and it was nominated for a Best Foreign Language Oscar at the time. It is available on YouTube. Or it was the last time I looked. I don't think it's available on DVD, which I keep saying, because this is a bit of a bugbear of mine. I keep saying it should be, and I hope somebody gets around to doing it. Anyway, that's a digression. So yeah, so those Undertones of War is very good. Edmund Blunden is an interesting person. His biography is very beautifully written. I found it. His memoir is very beautifully written. I think his might be the best written of the memoirs. I could be wrong. I might be being wrong about that. His is also the sort of attempt to be most accurate. Again, it's not. It's more episodic than sort of a continuing narrative, which happens a lot with these memoirs. But I really enjoyed it at the time, and I definitely recommend that one. I'm jumping on the most. Oh, again, Raw Welsh Fusiliers for Siegfried Sassoon. Then 1929, we go bananas. We've got Goodbye to All That, Death of a Hero, The Middle Parts of Fortune, All Quiet on the Western Front, Up to Memetz and Beyond. Oh no, actually, I've jumped ahead there. Sorry. So All Quiet on the Western Front is the last one. Sorry. I've talked about All Quiet on the Western Front. Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves is probably the first memoir that springs to people's minds from World War One. It's well written. It's not as historic. It's not as accurate as it could be, and Graves gets quite snotty about that. He rewrote the book in 1957, and there are some changes that make me really interested to read the original publication. I think he edited more about his personal life than the war stuff. Both Blunden and Sassoon did not like Goodbye to All That. Sassoon because it partly tells his own story, and I don't think Sassoon liked how it was told, and Blunden just took against it for faction inaccuracies. Graves is quite snotty about that in talking about the book, but Goodbye to All That it's still worth reading. It's still a very well written book, and as I said, it's the sort of one that pops up if you Google World War One memoirs. It's usually the first one to pop up. That and Testament of Youth, which we'll mention briefly. Death of a Hero by Richard Aldington is fiction, but again, it's thinly disguised memoir, and it's connected to HD's Bid Me to Live. I should read it because I've got some of these and I keep forgetting to hold them up. Bid Me to Live, and because Richard Aldington and Hilda Doolittle HD were married during World War One, and these both books tell sort of the story of that experience from the soldier and from the person at home. Richard Aldington's book is much more cynical, I think. It's told from the point of view of a friend of another soldier who's died, and about how nobody seems to care that he's died, and and the backstory to that. This is more about HD's own experience, both as a sort of dealing with. She lost a baby in 1915. Dealing with that, the consequences of Aldington going to war, and her desire to sort of become an artist. It's also very modernist. Aldington's book is quite straightforward and quite realistic. This is slightly more modernist, and so that's the difference. But I think if you're going to read one of them, you should read the others. And I'll say again, this should have a Penguin Modern Classic. If Aldington's is a Penguin Modern Classic, which it is, this should be a Penguin Modern Classic. Her Own Private's The Middle Parts of Fortune by Frederic Manning. Now, this was privately published in 1929. It's fiction, but again, thinly disguised fiction. Frederic Manning was Australian, but served as a private throughout most of World War One. He did go on a officer training course, but failed it or chose to fail it. So it's told from the point of view of a private soldier. This was privately published in 1929, and then you might have heard of it, the unexpurgated version, Her Own Private's We. This has all the swearing in it, basically, that the unexpurgated version doesn't want. So if you're going to read one, you should really read this version. The other version's fine, but actually one of the things about all these memoirs and fiction is the lack of swearing sometimes seems odd. Aldington, in his introduction to Death of a Hero, actually says, look, this isn't the language we used, but I've been told fundamentally that I can't do it in the language I want to write it in, so this is what you got. I've mentioned All Quiet on the Western Front, and again, I highly recommend that. What's next? Okay, so next is this is on Kindle. So I know. In 1930, Memoirs of an Infantry Officer by Siegfried Sassoon came out. I've mentioned that. This is if you're going to read one of the 3 books, Sherston books, you should read Memoir of an Infantry Officer. I recommend you read the whole trilogy. It's not particularly huge as a trilogy. Each book's about 200 and something pages, but I really recommend. You can buy it. It was published as a trilogy in 1937, I think, first of all, but it's in print still. But Memoirs of an Infantry Officer is another classic, and as I said, I love Siegfried Sassoon's writing. Next, in 1931, is Up to Memetz and Beyond by Llewellyn Grifiths, another Royal Welsh Fusilier. That's another one that people don't talk about very much, but again, he was a captain in the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, and it's an interesting account of his time in the armed forces. I really recommend it. I think it's good to read because it's not one of the ones that usually comes up on these kind of lists. And Llewellyn Grifiths I think he went on to become a poet, a novelist after the war. But he actually also worked I think he worked for the government as a civil servant. But he wrote several novels. I've not read anything else by him. I've only ever read this. So Up to Memetz and Beyond. Memetz is part of the Battle of the Somme, and there's a Welsh War Memorial up there there's a dragon memorial up by Memetz that's worth looking at if you ever get a chance. Then in 1933 we've got Old Soldiers Never Die and Testament of Youth. Now I've talked about Testament of Youth a lot, so I won't talk about that again. Testament of Youth, big chunky book. Testament of Youth, obviously, also, as I said in my big video, is more than just a memoir about World War One. It's about what it's like to be a fairly privileged woman in the 1900s in Britain. It takes in World War One, and it talks about her life after World War One a little bit as well. So, highly recommended. But bear in mind, it's not just about World War One. And then, finally, Old Soldiers Never Die by Frank Richards. Now, this is unusual because Frank Richards was a private soldier. He had been in the British Army before World War One started, had left and was on the reserve list, Royal Welsh Fusilier again, but was called up in 1914, served from 1914 to 1918, survived several major battles, and then returned to Wales. And the last bit of this is really about him trying to get a pension, mostly because he's got horrific hemorrhoids. That's a minor point. It's unusual as well because it's written by a private soldier. Apparently, Robert Graves helped him with some of the grammar and spelling, but it's interesting because tonally it's very different to a lot of the other books because it's a private soldier. So you get more stuff about like not volunteering for things and dodges and ways to get out of things but it's fundamentally he was a brave man. He shirk his duties, and he survived all 4 years of the war. So in that respect, I think this is a really, really interesting read. It's possibly the least well written one. It's much more chatty and much more less literary, but it's still fundamentally a good read. And as I said, it's a perspective you don't often get from these memoirs. So yeah, recommended. So there you go. That's my memoirs list. This has gone on for almost 26 minutes. I hope you find that useful and interesting. Please feel free to recommend other things that I might not have read. I've found some of the comments you've all put in on other videos with recommendations really useful, particularly for next year's Remembrance Reads. I might do based on some recommendations, I might do a Canada special next year, because I haven't really looked at Canada, and I was recommended several really good books about the Canadian Army in World War One. So yes, so that's my memoirs video covered. I hope you find it interesting. If you don't, please don't tell me. And I will speak to you soon. Have a good day. Bye bye.